Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Campbell Delahoyd. I'm with the National Association of State Energy Officials. I lead our Energy Security and Resilience team. On behalf of NASEO and our Energy Security Committee, I'd like to welcome everybody to the 2025 Winter Energy Outlook. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, this annual briefing is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy and helps states understand the seasonal nature of energy markets and supply chains, anticipate severe winter weather impacts, and prepare for coordinated response. Before we get into the presentations today, we'll go over a couple housekeeping items. But prior to that, I want to run through just a very high level agenda. As usual, we'll start today off with a weather picture and how states can interpret it. We'll move into look at fuel supply, demand, and inventories. Then we'll pivot over to the power systems winter reliability outlook, and finally hone in on some propane inventories, logistics, and coordination touch points for states. We've built in Q&A after each presentation and a panel Q&A towards the end. We do have a firm stop at 5 p.m. Eastern today. So as we're going through the presentations, please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A box at any time. It's helpful if you do include your name and affiliation sometimes, especially if we have any follow-ups or if we're unable to get to your question. We also ask that folks don't use any AI chatbots. It can sometimes mess up the Zoom system, and I just wanted to flag that here. Lastly, slides and follow-up resources will be shared after the webinar, subject to our wonderful speakers' respective approvals. If we don't get to your question or you do have any follow-ups, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll drop, or actually my information is in the original registration, so feel free to reach out if you have any issues or outstanding questions. So with that, we will move right along. So it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Ben Bolton. Ben is the Assistant Director for Energy Security, Emergency Preparedness, and Resilience at the Tennessee Office of Energy Programs, and Ben is also the co-chair of NASEO's Energy Security Committee. Ben, thanks for walking us through today's session, and I will hand it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Campbell, for those introductory remarks. I'm real excited about our annual energy outlook for winter. It's always a great outlook to head us into that. And with the fall weather finally kicking in for a lot of us today, I think it's a good time to do that. And more importantly, hear what they have to say. So we start off with the weather, then we get into more of the pricing, and then some more from NERC itself. So without further ado, I'm not going to take up a lot of time with intros so that you can hear more from them. You hear enough from me on a regular basis as it is. Let's first start with Sunny Westcott, who's a federal chief meteorologist. We're going to give her a while to walk us through what the outlook looks like. And it's pure chaos, right, Sunny?
Absolutely is. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so that you guys can follow along. And we're really going to talk about a couple of different ways to perceive the information that you're going to be handed today. So it's unfortunately not the easiest forecast, which I'm sure many of you already anticipated. It's going to be a little bit more of a wild ride than what we're used to when it comes to weather. A lot more pivots between who gets what, so the have and have nots when it comes to precipitation, the better temperatures, the more moderate temperatures versus the fluctuations of extremes. From that, that's also what we're seeing in other countries right now. So I'll also give an outlook for a little bit of the international activity and what the Southern Hemisphere already indicated was likely to be on the table as they closed out their winter and are now entering into the spring for places like Australia and into South Africa, where they're already reporting record-breaking warmth on the tail end of their winter. So what we're really talking about, the pivot in our weather systems as full, is really looking at the overall implications of what it meant to have been so warm throughout the year this year. So you'll see here in the graphic that we had the black line at the second nearest to the top is this current year, and the line right above that for our 10 warmest years on record. The warmest year on record, having been last year, is really setting us up for failure when we lean on model forecasting, because our models are trained off of historics. So for violating historics left and right, this is sort of setting a precedence that we can't trust the models to fully comprehend the totality of the impact from our storm systems. So when we're looking at what forecast matrices we can rely on, we have the ENSO index everyone's very fond of. What that means for continental weather is really just a change in our pattern flow. So whether we have a more amplified pattern, that means more north-south variation in the storm, which brings with it more intense temperature swings between the high and the low. So you remember this past winter, we had a La Nina in. We have a weak La Nina going forward. And what this means for our precipitation, as you'll see, is that most of our snowfall is going to fall in very significant pockets in just two main areas of the US. We're going to see a lack of the precipitation that we want in the Four Corners region, which will have hydropower implications going forward into next year, which is a lot when we're talking about what is it going to mean to produce hydro in some of these southern basins. So looking at areas like the upper Mississippi, the Missouri River system, looking at what does it mean to see heavy snowfall there that melts off prematurely will also be a big part of the conversation. So a La Nina and the change in the intensity of the pattern of our systems means that we are expecting the temperature fluctuations like last year to range higher. And so what we saw in Nebraska in February of 2025 was a temperature spring from the lowest temperature to the highest temperature of 104 degrees spread in about a week and a half. For most materials, they don't like that, but also for acclimation for human bodies, we can't acclimate to that great of a spread, which means we're running our heat and our cold back and forth. So we're likely to see a very similar effect go forward this year, which is why our autumn has already taken on similar characteristics. We have fluctuated between hot and cold a little bit too much already. Some of the implications when people say, well, let's look at historics and see if we can draw any sort of trends. Unfortunately, a weak La Nina, which I've highlighted here in purple, very difficult to look at historics and get a definitive picture to say this is absolutely what it's going to look like because we're in a weak La Nina. All it really shows to us is the standard in the middle, which is our central plains are forecastable. Parts of our northern plains into the upper Mississippi River Basin are a little bit more forecastable. And unfortunately, when we're looking at precipitation delineation, it can be a flip-flop between two. So we're not going to look at historics for the forecast. I recommend just tossing those out as a notion, and I know everybody wants to use them. I would look at more of what we've already seen as a signaling, which we'll talk about, and then what the Southern Hemisphere showed us is likely on trend for this year, as they did show us last year what was going to be on table as far as that freak snowstorm event for the southern half of the US. South Africa had reported right beforehand in their winter season 6 feet of snowfall in a day. So when we see these trends in other spheres, the southern hemisphere, we need to be tracking that into our forecast. Some of the other things that we want to consider going forward is the updates to certain things like the Farmer's Almanac and NOAA's. I always make sure that we balance both. I don't have a preference when it comes to data sets on sort of mass accumulation of information. So what does this mean for the generalities in the energy side of the house? A lot of our rural communities rely on the Farmer's Almanac. So it's important to know what they're going to be looking at as far as what kind of needs or preparation they may take into consideration. They may not prepare if they're in an area the Farmer's Almanac has said is not going to get hit hard or is not going to see significant temperature plunges. Unfortunately, this means that the most of our southeast is going to be ill prepared for any nor'easter that likely comes through if they focus solely on the Farmer's Almanac. The other side of the house is you'll notice it just says chilly, very cold, and then cold. So doesn't really give a whole lot of notion of what that would mean for the human body, what that means to prepare, plan when it comes to things like backup generation. So again, just things to keep in the back of your mind as far as other considerations go. This forecast was updated yesterday. So there's a little bit of variation from what they had put out just a couple of days prior, and then what they put out today. They did change it pretty significantly to include this one goes out to February, and the one from a couple of days ago only went out to January. So in this latest one, what's changed from the one that was out earlier last week, what we saw was a temperature pivot. We are still expecting the southern half of the US, abnormal warmth. That's across the board on average. I want to foot stomp that phrase, on average. So that means for that entire seasonality that we're expecting the baseline to be higher than normal. However, freak events where they will see the plunge are not captured here. So when we're looking at things like this abnormal intensity of precipitation, we are expecting for heavy snowfall events. Absolutely going to be a problem this year. What we're anticipating from this is that the freeze will not keep all the snow where the snow falls. We are likely going to see an increase in our avalanche activity. That's going to be a huge problem for the communities across the Rockies and in the Northeast, where we've had significant drought, drying heat as far as all the vegetation that's there, and the Canadian wildfire smoke, which creates a higher level of arsenic and mercury on our mountain terrain, which destabilizes our snowpack. So it's important to understand, yes, you will get your snow. You will get too much at once. It will melt off prematurely. And because our river levels in many areas are still so very low, we are likely to see more ice dams going forward because it'll be easier for those to freeze, despite the fact that the overall temperature in many areas will continue to warm. Unfortunately, a lot of our hydro up further to the north is going to face a more notable freeze because of this drought. So the other sides of the house, when we're looking at the decline in snowfall, we're saying that, yes, we are going to get snowfall this year. Is it going to be record-breaking snowfall? Not for most of the US, which is going to hyper add on to the last couple of years of not having had enough snowfall in certain states. Some states, which have reported a complete loss over the last 2 years, are now going to get that dumping of snow, while the others around them will likely be skipped. So when we're looking at places like Minnesota, Minnesota did not see enough snow from this last season, but is highlighted in most forecast graphics for getting too much snow this year. So we're going to have to pivot our response and really trust what is happening in the now when it comes to the forecast about 2 weeks in advance for when we're looking at our precipitation models. This is a great graphic just to show you major cityscapes and their totality of snowfall against typical weak La Nina scenarios. Not super helpful to be able to say we're expecting more or less. What we are anticipating when we look at these are places like Virginia, a little bit more soft for wear in some of our more rural communities over in the Roanoke at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. However, the rest of these not super helpful, just to say that we're likely to see snow. But this is, again, based off historics, which are getting violated because of that baseline temperature swing. How do we look at this in the forecast then? That's probably the best way that I can make this make sense to you guys. You can see what's happening in other countries about a month and 2 weeks in advance to be able to track major pivots that are en route. So what we do is we go to the 500 millibar height of the atmosphere. So the atmosphere from the surface of the earth up to our jet stream, that's essentially our entirety of our troposphere where all of our weather occurs. The higher up you go, you can set some of those parameters on these models. I recommend the 500 millibar. The 700 is really good to understand steering flow for tropical cyclones. 500 will show you those temperatures and where our coldest pockets are sitting and what they may be doing to the flow of our weather across the whole northern hemisphere. So you'll see here, this was just a couple of days ago that this was taken, and you'll see it's pretty wobbly, and that means that we're likely to see more of that swing from one extreme to the other because we have that wobble. That's a La Nina-like effect. So it makes sense that we're looking at La Nina and not an El Nino, where it'd be more like a blanket, like what we see over there for Russia. So when we're looking at this, do we think that there's a major intensity pivot? Yes, because we can see some warming happening over there in Siberia. What does it mean to see that warming kick off? That'll amplify the rest of the wobble outside of what would have been a very blanket, very even winter that we essentially just watched get taken away from us. So when we're looking at these pivots, this is how you understand. I can see over Russia right now that they have a pretty significant winter weather event and a very notable cold pocket that's likely outside of seasonal norms. So then what I do is I go and I scrape their social media for their weather implications to be able to see, yes, they are seeing record cold already in Russia. What just happened over there with Mount Everest? 700 people got stuck on the mountain because of a blizzard. And over there in Switzerland, they just had a major blizzard that also stranded and isolated a few communities for a few days. So we're already tracking. The other continents have reported significant winter weather events have kicked off. We've already had our first winter weather event here in the US, and we've already seen a couple of states report that increase towards those colder temperatures. We are likely to see come into the next 5 days our pattern shift to take in the event that's coming off of Russia into the US based off of the timeline difference. So you'll just see these pattern shifts and you'll be able to really track them. Now, what's a comparable? A comparable would be 2020 to 2021. So many of us remember that because of the Texas deep freeze event, but you'll notice a very similar pattern, albeit a little bit less wobbly on the other side, flipped. So what they started with was more of the blanket on our side of the northern hemisphere, and they had more of the wobble. So when we're looking at this, what does it mean to shift our pattern recognition to be able to go from it's very cold over here to it's very cold over in Russia, there and by we need to be prepared for our weather events to be more premature when they start and that they're likely going to carry later effects. So we are likely to see May continue to propagate some of our winter weather, unlike earlier this year where we warmed very quickly. We will still see those swings of warmth, but you remember at the end of March, we had the ice storm over there in Michigan. Likely to see more ice storms this year than we're used to, more nor'easters, more frequent nor'easters at that. We have a lot of coastal spin-ups because what happens with our storms is that our storms want to pull off and over to Europe and they kind of split in half. One gets lost and then from that wraps up the coastline. So we've already had one nor'easter, not to say that that's a record in time, but to say that that's a really good indicator. We've had a nor'easter. We've already had our first freeze. We've already had our first snowfall. Thereby, we are right on schedule for an earlier onset of more damaging winter weather and a longer season in the aspect of from very beginning to very end of the cold pockets at the 500 millibar. So our temperature swings, what do they look like when we're talking about impacts? This is what I mean. So this is a graphic to say for the 27th of October, abnormal warming across the central US begins to pivot. We have an abnormal cold pocket over there in the Appalachian Mountains. And then you'll notice that they flip. Then we have abnormal cold over in the Pacific Northwest and abnormal warming over in the east. So you'll notice our coastlines are going to continue to flip flop between who is abnormal. We would like to see the colors be far less intense. We would prefer, in order for there to be a stable winter, for these colors to be more widespread and more like one whole continent for a particular time, and then a shift for the continent to be a different color for the next time, instead of this 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 that we're seemingly going through. So this is what I mean when I say people will be accessing both their heat and their air conditioning back and forth, because it'll be very difficult to acclimate. It'll also be very difficult to keep livestock going. So for some of our larger industries out there who run major HVAC facilities for the livestock to be able to heat or cool them to keep them from needing to sweat because they struggle with that, it's just going to be an additive threat. When we're talking about what does it mean to see these stronger storms, these storms will pack a bigger punch than what we're used to as far as precipitation and winds. Winds will be stronger ahead of and behind these storm events. So as we're going forward, be aware that the stronger the storm, the greater the impact of the surface, absolutely, but likely to be immediately followed with the secondary threat of everything the storm just gave you in precipitation getting evaporated right back out again, or going through the water cycle a little bit too quickly. So when we're looking at this as a major impact, just going through the whole scale of first, second, third order effects, on that side, when we say we're expecting more ice, many of you know that means more damage to the power lines. It means with stronger winds, galloping is going to be a major concern, where the wind lines now whip back and forth with that weight on it, which will create an additive as far as not only outages, but damage from tree branches likely to go up. Many of these areas have been in drought. Many states have been in drought this year. Water tables are too low. The roots are unable to tap it. Branches are weaker than usual. Ice pile up on our trees will take out many of these branches. We saw this with Austin a couple years ago. We are likely to see this as a widespread issue going forward this winter, just based off of what areas already saw evaporative demand go through the roof just over the last 7 months. So when we're looking at trends, we are looking at it being more of a 50-50 split. So just some things to be aware of that came out recently from Climate Central. Different graphics on ways to consider what areas are likely to see less snow, what areas are likely to see more snow. It is going to be a have and have not situation when it comes to both precipitation and beneficial winter weather. So you guys will get all these slides. You can dive into some of these new stats. They do highlight certain cities by name. They studied more than 731 cities. So from that, you can pick and pull between your specific city. AccuWeather put out their forecast, and their forecast went all the way from September onward. So I included all of them. Again, balancing your different data sources, being able to figure out who had it right will lead in very heavily to who you trust for spring. So that'll be the other side of the conversation. Fires obviously were a little bit easier to do. Areas that were hit by drought had windstorm events likely to kick off. Makes sense for a lot of these areas. Be aware of our major threat going through the rest of fall for the Appalachians as far as fire concern goes. Any of our lightning strikes, our area is very primed and ready to ignite. Now, just to touch on again really quickly, the western half of the United States and the drought situation there. Evaporative demand is going up. Our drought is expected to get worse there because they are expected to be skipped over for precipitation. So you'll notice this drought outlook is updated from just a couple of days ago. We are anticipating the Northeast will continue to dry as well. So many of you have seen the reports. There's been emergency declarations. There's been the need for digging wells down. And we are what areas that do have rivers flowing right now that are at lower than usual are likely to see some of those water issues propagate out as it freezes and thaws in unnatural ways, causing more of that water to siphon out into the soils. And that's going to continue to feed into next year's problem. So right now, the big positive is going to be that certain areas of Texas that are really needing precipitation will at least get some. And then some of our northern basin that does need precip, like the Pacific Northwest, is primed to get a lot more, which will be beneficial for our major generating stations up there in Washington. Be aware that Elephant Butte as a reservoir is down at 4%. So that gives us a really good idea of what's going to happen with the Rio Grande. And then we back that up and we say, what does the rest of the Colorado River situation look like? We did not get out of the 20 to 35% for either Lake Mead or Lake Powell this year, which means we're likely going to see that struggle continue. And again, if Wyoming does not get enough, it'll be very difficult to distribute downstream. And our fire weather concerns, again, really looking at the Appalachians just over the next couple of months. And then, of course, Central Texas, which is still in a very notable drought. What did we see in the Southern Hemisphere to really hang our hat on as far as major concerns go? Australia, there were two very, very big 50-50 split. So we had some of the areas that got all the snow, all the precip, record-setting precipitation, and then other areas which shut down all ski resorts and all winter weather activities because they got none. Now, the difference between that is we also saw a notable increase in our hail events, and then from that, damaging winds. You'll see that they reported record-breaking power outages in some areas of Africa as well. So it's important to balance what did the Southern Hemisphere see. If both areas saw significant severe weather, which is stormy weather, and then a downpouring of snow in one specific area, whereas the area that normally gets hit was bypassed. So that's going to be our big indicator. If you see the models indicating that, trust it because we've already seen it happen so far this year. Now, these are some of the records on things to be aware of as far as international implications go. So you'll notice Antarctica just reported record temperatures. That's not great for anybody as far as sea level rise goes. Some of the other ones, heat, flood, heat, again, looking at Europe, other events that have gone on. You'll notice the Everest notes in there, 800 travelers there were stuck. We've also, again, seen from this significant impacts across Russia, as well as, of course, the tariffs that are back and forth in that area. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at Siberian permafrost thaw, which means that their fracking sites, their coal sites as well, and their copper sites are all being stressed and strained. China has just recently reactivated a bunch of their coal sites in an attempt to shore up energy ahead of this season. And of course, India is already reporting what they are anticipating to be a record cold winter. So when we're looking at this, everyone is in relatively the same level of panic, and we are seeing record lightning activity to match. So whether you're fluctuating between one or the other, we are anticipating damage and we are anticipating greater need than what we have seen. What else is going on that could be a stressor? Other countries have started kind of activating this water wars concept. So you may have seen that in the news over the last forever as it stands, but drought in the Middle East and drought in Northern Africa have continued to become a major issue. The Grand Ethiopian Dam actually just fully began operating. So we do have some notes about that in here. And then, of course, we have some major concerns about infrastructure damage that have just come out across the board. So what I did was I kind of created major repositories for things like our lithium reserves being stressed and strained in areas of drought. What does it mean to operate when we're talking about these blizzards in China, record cold in Russia, and all of these implications that we're seeing across the Middle East as far as the have and have nots for both energy and water. So these are just some different ways to consider it, and different ways that you can map it is with this new heat and cold stress tool that just came out. So I gave a bunch of negative information to also give you a new tool. So from this tool, if you haven't played around with it, you can find your canary in the coal mine in another country, and you can monitor it live as well to see what they're currently going through as far as either heat or cold, and the stress that they may see from that, and then subsequently go and do data scraping for what they may be experiencing in the media and how that may be driving some of their purchase points. So you'll also notice that they have the past, so you can do a comparison to past events, as well as you can compare country to country for current events. So that's just very beneficial as a tool going forward. And then I just want to end off my last couple of minutes here with just talking about different fun ways that we can consider the weather threats going forward. So if we're saying there's going to be a change in this winter season with the health and the viability of our forest, be aware that some of our cryptids, when we go to communicate these threats to general society, to each other, that we're also keeping our cryptid friends in mind. And with that, talking about Bigfoot real quick, just throwing it out there that as we see the pivot in extreme cold and then the pivot to warmth, that our hibernation patterns are shifting, which means in some of these areas, especially the southern half of the US, that we're anticipating that creatures will not hibernate as long. They will need more food and they'll become more aggressive. Even some creatures that are anticipated to be more friendly, likely to be a little bit more violent. And yes, this does mean that we are anticipating some of these creatures to move further to the north. So anticipating sighting shifts for areas that we are anticipating overall snowpack loss, just to be aware that we are anticipating that habitat to shift and those creatures to move further into caves or to move further into northern latitudes if possible for where they're at. So you'll just see that our overall snowpack is expected to go down in many of our oldest mountain ranges over the next 75 years. So expect sightings to change. And then, of course, as our wildfires continue to be a threat in areas like the Appalachians, be aware that that would move creatures like Mothman. And so when we're having these conversations with our restoration crews, to just be aware of the extra threats of both the creatures that are in the areas being impacted, as well as those who may be out and about and in these regions, because it's everything from our oceans changing their acidity level and their warmth all the way through to more algae blooms. More algae blooms clog up water intake. That's a major problem set, as well as just the overall pivot to the ecology of the region, trying to do its best to do temperature mitigation. So these are just different ways that we can communicate what a pivot in winter weather would look like as we go forward. Because again, it's important to just be able to communicate the risk. It's important to be able to look at what would this mean for operating in this area, operating in the industry as international pivots occur. And then with that, I do have a fantastically updated graphic about our power outages in 2024 with both the outages as a whole and outages minusing our outliers by county. So that's provided for everybody by IFP, which will be in the slide deck at the end. So pending any questions, that concludes my brief.
Oh my gosh, thank you for the wild ride, Sonny. And take a breath and a sip, please. There are some hands raised. As a reminder, please ask your question in the chat feature so that we can, or in the Q&A. Somebody already asked if the link for the heat cool stress map could be put in the chat, please. You can do that after you finish talking. That would let people go ahead and start messing around with that. We will make the slides available after the presentation for those that are, the recording will be shared and the registrants will be later this week after we get the final presentation. Some people may have to scrub some things from it. So we always do that later in the week. So you will get the slides, you will get the recording if you missed anything or if you want to hear the fun thing again. Ed asked if Bigfoot would move more northerly, is what he's hearing from that.
Yes, and so what we would be seeing is an overall change. You've noticed this with the polar bear discussion up in the Arctic and in Siberia, is that our polar bears are leaving Alaska to go to Russia to get into those more further northerly areas that are seeing cold still. Same thing is happening with our crabs, and that's also another part of the food chain, is that we're looking at our fisheries and our overall, secondary animalistic movements, the birds, the mosquitoes, all of that, to start pushing further and further north to match the seasons and the temperatures that fit them best.
Well, I did have one question with it, and you touched on a little bit about the polar vortices, because hearing that it could be like 2020 gives chills down my spine for the winter storms that we experienced with Uri, and then a few years later with Elliott up here in Tennessee. Are there any signs that we can recognize polar vortex before they begin to form, basically? I know sometimes 2 or 3 weeks out we can get a good, but is there something earlier than that that gives us a hint?
Yes, so I'll also put that link into the chat. For the 500 millibar, you can not only compare going back about 10 years, but you can also move it forward. While I say you can move it forward like 4 days and everyone's responses, that doesn't go out far enough. You can look again over at what's going on in Europe and Russia, because all the weather in the Northern Hemisphere moves like a carousel. So we get what they're going through and we give our storms like our nor'easter over to Europe. So it's important to be able to track that whole flow. You can see the storms coming about a month and a half in advance. You could do it about 2 months in advance for major pivots if you wanted to monitor it, but I would say about a month, month and a half for any adequate forecaster, about a month out for non-forecasters to look at that, to say that's a concerning shift I see in the temperature disparity and the wind intensities. What will that look like by the time it gets here? And that's a good conversation to bring to meteorologists, to say, I'm seeing record events in Russia right now, record events in the Koreas, record events moving into Alaska. What will that change for me here in my state? And they should be able to give you that answer in notice.
Thank you. That's exactly what kind of knowledge we need to help. I know anybody that knows me from Tennessee, I'm always worried about the chickens, because the polar vortices dictate our propane supply and tighten it to keep those chicken flowing to all our good restaurants that serve up fried chicken. The other one, were there other questions? Paul, it sounds like that answered yours, looking at the chat. I do
So I
believe
do want to
Chris.
take a quick second about
Yeah,
polar
sure.
vortexes, and an important part of how they happen and what they are is
Okay.
really a Canadian low pressure and then a low pressure that comes into the US. The Canadian low will slow down. Our low will come across, And what'll happen is they'll tilt into each other. So you'll end up with cold air connected from the actual Arctic Circle all the way down to Mexico. So you should be able to see when a Canadian low slows down and a new low of ours looks like it's coming in lower, and what that would look like as they move under each other. That one is a very iconic pattern that has to be already in
Okay.
place for it to develop. So it cannot develop short notice. It has to be forecastable out about 2 weeks minimum for the Canadian low to already be there.
Again, helpful. All right, Chris, I think you had a question as well. If you could put that in the Q&A, we can ask that. I will go on to another one that we wanted to ask, which was um, what to you are indicators or patterns that are useful to anticipate cascading impacts, like power and natural gas disruptions from severe storms?
I would say looking at some of the major wind problems that we're experiencing in other countries right now. So a big part about the wind disruption is that the stronger the low pressure, the more damaging that temperature swing will be. It'll likely lead with severe weather and precipitation, which is not ideal, followed by that deeper freeze because of those stronger winds. You cannot get a temperature profile spread without stronger winds. So if you see a forecast say temperatures are going to go from 75 to 7, the only way to get there is through wind. There is no, oh, the cold air just dropped down with no force. It has to come in damagingly, and that will, one, pre saturate everything, and then two, stress it. So you'll have wind ahead of the storm, and then as the storm comes out, like what we're experiencing right now in the mid Atlantic, is right after a storm, we're having a whole day of very damaging wind gusts come through. And a lot of people seem surprised about it because it's so clear skies. But in order for the cold air to come in, we are going to see these strong damaging wind events. So that's a big indicator for damage, is that we're likely to see these temperature swings with strong damaging winds.
That makes a lot more sense of it for me, and we just experienced that. So I can attest to that. We dropped about 20 degrees in a wonderful way here, but wasn't too damaging ultimately. I was going to ask about regional differences, but frankly, you already touched on that in a really great way because and the international scope of how Russia's weather is kind of an indicator towards our weather to come. I think is something that's going to be new for it was new for me at least, and hopefully for some others as well. So
It'll be a little bit harder to get that data out this year, which I've already noticed as a meteorologist. Some of the avenues I usually lean on are a little bit more restrictive on saying certain weather event information. So for those of you who just do open source data scraping, you will have to take it a step further and you'll have to look at some of the atmospheric models. The good news is we have weather stations that are out there, so you can find live data if you need to. And if you ever need to drill all the way down, we can always find a way to get the model data over that area aligned with the live data. It's just an extra step, but if you can find live reporting or tune into one of their weather channels through some other app, I recommend just paying attention to some of the different major cities.
excellent. And or if you're lucky enough for me, we have a state meteorologist now in emergency management that's only about 10 feet from my office, so I can ask her. But for others, that if you don't have a state meteorologist, find out if you do, or to get in touch with your local weather service. They're usually really great about helping you understand forecasts, come up with ones. Also, remember, most of your power companies have their own meteorologists as well. Those are good people to meet and get to know as well, because for hydro assets and others, they keep up with the weather because that's generation and a good way to understand how your utilities track weather at that level, and also another good source to get in contact with folks about that. I don't see any other questions at the moment, so I will say thank you so much for the sunny outlook. I couldn't resist. All right, and with that, why don't we go over to Tom now? Tom O'Connor is the Vice President of Fuels and Energy Security at ICF and is going to be telling us about the prospects for data and trends for this winter. Thanks
Okay,
so
well,
much, Tom.
thanks, Ben. Thanks, Ben. Everybody can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, and okay, there you go. And yeah, that was a phenomenal presentation, Sonny. I really appreciate it. I have no idea how you got your name, but Sonny is certainly not appropriate. So, but that was great. So thanks, Ben. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Our fuels and energy security team provides a somewhat unique role to our clients. We focus on energy resilience and ensuring that our clients understand critical energy assets and interdependencies. So our perspective here will not necessarily be a price forecast, but more on the potential issues which you may need to prepare for this winter. And after Sunny's presentation, I think it dovetails very nicely with some of the potential issues we may have to deal with. And next slide, please. Oh, okay. Now I probably should have gone to that one. That's just basically telling what I just told you. So go on to the next one, please. So some of the key takeaways that we're going to be talking about here. The weather outlook is somewhat favorable. Prices are relatively low, and it's not looking like a terribly severe winter, but that's only a good start. What worries us are a number of things this winter. And one is that Europe's been importing U.S. heating fuels for a long time, more so even in the last few months. So one avenue of potential diesel resupply if New England gets very cold may not be available. Secondly, natural gas stocks are pretty typical of prior years in most regions, and that's good. But fuel oil stocks in New England utilities are low and very low, and that could cause a problem if a significant cold snap occurs and people have to shift from natural gas to diesel or fuel oil. Propane stocks overall aren't bad, but there are some emerging market changes that may put the upper Midwest at risk, and I should say more at risk than they normally are at risk. So we'll talk about that as well. And I don't have it on the slide here, but I will have a couple slides on the ULSK supply in New England. Kerosene is very critical in the upper Midwest and in the Northeast. And we'll take a look at that data and pricing information to see what may materialize this winter. Okay. And let's see. Okay, we'll talk about propane first, and you can go on to the next one. The propane focus on the key takeaways here is typically on the Northeast and Midwest, and this year is no different. Stocks are reasonably good, and the weather forecast is not terribly negative, a bit erratic perhaps, but not terribly negative. Crop drying demands may be a bit higher due to a very large corn crop, but it should be manageable. There are possible impacts to traditional response mechanisms in the event of severe cold, and this is stemming from growth in Canadian export terminals, which will have a direct impact on the upper Midwest. The Northeast is also tight on storage, although the presence of propane exports from the Marcus Hook and Mariner pipeline system can provide some relief once supply gets tight. Okay, next slide. There you go. Okay, so I'm not going to go through everything here, but overall propane stocks look good in each of the pad regions. Pad 3 levels are robust going into the winter, but as you know, the focus down there is on exports and the petrochemical business. So stocks in the more vulnerable pads 1 and pad 2 are reasonably good at this point, but it is obviously very early. Okay. Okay, taking a closer look at the propane stocks in the pad 2 major subregions, and this is based on EIA data from the end of July. So there hasn't been an update since then on these numbers. But the numbers were basically below average in most locations. Michigan was above average. And since then, overall stocks have increased about 4 million barrels. which is good, but also not quite where things would normally be expected to be at this time of year. And again, this is in the, not in the entire Midwest, but most of the inventory is in these states. Um, we don't have the sub-region updates, like I said. However, one thing to note is that Kansas and Michigan have far more propane in storage than the upper Midwest and the central Midwest states. So the Kansas levels are almost 10 million barrels, and Michigan is 6 million barrels, or they will be at 6 million barrels probably by now. So things have been increasing, but most of the inventory is in Michigan and in Kansas, and that creates some challenges. If you notice, and you probably can't read it all that well, but the stock levels in Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, which is a high vulnerability area, are are below where they should have been back in July. Hopefully, they've built up to the 5-year average, but that's only about 1 million barrels in all three states. And in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, stocks were below average, and now they've built up a bit since then, I'm sure, but still they're not great. So these are locations that are at risk because the resupply options aren't all that great. So I'll talk little bit more about that, I think, on the next slide or two. Thank you. Okay, so this is a busy slide, and it's got pipelines and everything in it, but basically, propane supply in the Midwest comes from the large NGL fractionators in the Conway, Kansas area, and also the fractionators in Sarnia and the propanizer facilities in Rapid River and Superior, Wisconsin, which pull out NGLs from the Enbridge Line 5 on its way to Sarnia. The pipelines from Conway include the Mid-America Pipeline, One Oak, and New Star pipelines that are in green, orange, and purple, respectively, on the map. These move propane and other fuels, including butane, into upper Midwest markets and can get very congested in winter markets. The propane pipeline terminals are small. They're all the little dots that you see here on the screen. And most of them are very small. They don't hold more than a couple thousand barrels of propane in many cases. Demand spikes are difficult to manage because of that, and the severe weather will also inhibit rail resupply. Some of them can receive by rail, not all of them can receive by rail, and that rail typically will come from Canada, although some rail does come from the Bakken. So while the Sarnia and Marysville caverns are significant, there's no pipeline connectivity to other Midwest markets. So there can be a lot of truck movements. Hours of service waivers are often required to help cope with severe weather demands across the region. And, the Marysville caverns are near Sarnia. So, trucks from there into Ohio and Indiana are feasible. Over to Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, not so much. So it's a tough area to supply, in particular the Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa region if there are high demands. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Canada. Hard to understate how important Canadian propane supply is into PADD 2. I mentioned the rail movements that can come into terminals in Iowa and up and down the Group 3 region, the Dakotas and Nebraska. And that's great. Okay, so and Line 5, which believe me is a critical pipeline, provides NGL to the small depropanizers in Superior, Wisconsin, and Rapid River. But those primarily supply local needs and that radiate out from those locations. They're not supplying a large volume of the Wisconsin, Minnesota market. But Line 5 does provide NGL over to the Sarnia fractionators. Propane is extracted in Sarnia and it's shipped back into Michigan. and stocks in Michigan caverns and Marysville will increase by 4 or 5 million barrels every summer, which build up to like 6 or 7 million barrels total of supply, which is used to supply Michigan consumers along with consumers in Indiana and Ohio by truck. So that volume is critical to those states having the propane they need to get through the winter. The challenge here is that in recent years, Canada has developed export facilities in British Columbia, and these report in oh, okay. I'm reading the question while I'm talking. I shouldn't be doing that. In recent years, Canada has developed export facilities in British Columbia, which receive propane by rail and load cargoes for shipment to Asian markets. This has been and will continue to pull propane away from the upper Midwest. Okay, a little more on those export facilities because they're important. To provide some perspective, this analysis by EIA shows that since 2018, more and more propane is being exported to Asia. The demand in Asia is not seasonal, and the market for petrochemical feedstocks provides a better return to propane suppliers. And there's also no sign that the demand in Asia is ending. Rail exports over this period have declined by about 20%. And by period, I mean from 2018 until today. And more export capacity is under construction and should be available by late 2026. So if the capacity is there, it's going to be used to the degree they can use it and sell it for better prices in Asia. And the fact that it's a ratable demand and not seasonal, means it's an ongoing level of revenue for Canadians. They don't have to store as much propane, and that means there's going to be less potentially available to respond to spikes that have been supplied by rail from Canada. So that's something to watch out for. It's there now. It's going to get more severe in the future, and we can go on to the next slide, which I'm going to talk a little bit about natural gas and electricity. It's not my strength. I'm sure we'll hear from. I'm sure we'll hear from um, Bob here shortly on that. But this slide, it's an EIA slide again, basically shows that in the four major areas, the Pacific, the South Central, Midwest, and East, that the dotted line is the current time, and natural gas and storage has increased to typical levels, typical with recent history, and that's a good thing. And EIA is also forecasting an outlook with normal winter gas draws from storage. And obviously that will be somewhat dependent on the weather as well, but that's built into the EIA forecast. So while the storage is good, we need to be mindful that each year there's more and more load from data centers that's going to require more and more power generation. And most of that load is going to be met from the gas-fired generation. Since that load is not seasonal either, it may be tougher to build storage for natural gas in the future, and gas withdrawal capacity may become more important. Okay. And most of you are aware of the kind of cascading implications. There's a lot of words on this slide. I'm not going to read them. Basically, it explains how things can cascade quickly during severe cold spells. Increased demand for gas for home heating and generation stresses the gas supply system in pipeline constrained locations. This can cause gas for generation to be curtailed to protect home heating needs, and generators can also be damaged in severe weather, as we saw in Uri. With gas supply tight, storage can be drawn, but pipeline constraints may require shifting of some generation to oil-fired fuel. The high demands on gas and electricity can lead to grid reliability issues, especially if oil supply to generators is insufficient to sustain power generation. That will also result in significant volatility in gas and power markets. So, in markets where dual-fired generators exist, it's important to track where oil reserves at power plants reside. I mean the level, not where they reside. They reside at the power plant. If these stocks are inadequate, there can be real concerns that these stocks can be quickly depleted and replenishment by barge or pipeline or truck can be impeded by the same severe weather. Okay, next one. Kind of I'm not going to go through this in detail either, but to demonstrate this, the polar vortex in 2017-18 is a good example. With gas supply shifted to residential, generators in New England required a major shift to fuel oil supply, which also included startup of some less efficient, higher emissions generators. This sustained the system through the vortex, but the volume of oil-fired generation required was substantial, increasing total diesel demands by about 25% above normal seasonal demands for up to 2 weeks, or about 1 million barrels of additional draw on fuel oil. So, so where, okay, next slide, please. So how are we doing this year in advance of winter? Well, not so good. So, uh, so New England is not ready for a vortex or even a bad cold snap in 25-26. Based on stocks as of October 7th, there's only 2.1 million barrels of stocks of fuel oil, mostly diesel, in front of generators. The total capacity to store stocks has declined over the period, as you can see from the dotted line. But more importantly, the actual implications of the vortex in 2017-18 and of the cold spell in 2022 showed drops of over 1 million barrels of fuel oil in both cases in resident that were at the power plants, and they were restored over time. But when you're dropping from 4 million barrels or 3 million barrels or down by 1 million barrels, it's one thing. When you're dropping from 2 million barrels, a lot depends on where those 2 million barrels are and where the demand is. So this is all in New England, so it's just a snapshot in New England, but it's something that's worrisome for this year, and I think it's a bit of a red flag. So with crude prices relatively low, it may be possible for utilities to purchase some diesel or stocks to boost stocks while they're there, if there's still time. But if not, there may be risks regardless of the overall forecast. There's likely, as Sonny said, there's going to be some serious cold spells this winter, and when they happen, the stocks are going to need to be there to be able to do it, because replenishing by barge from New York Harbor or truck is not that uh, effective in cold weather. And so we'll talk a little bit about overall distillate stocks next. And okay, on the heating oil side, um, uh, and this is really looking at ULSD around the nation. Distillate stocks in pads 4 and 5 are good. Pad 3 is near normal. And of course, pad 3 is a big export center for distillates as well. Pad 2 was way, way below the 5-year average, but due to an extended run of high refinery production, they're now near normal. However, the recent BP Whiting issue a few days ago and the big drop in crude runs in last week's EIA data, runs dropped by like about 600,000 barrels per day in Pad 2. That's not helpful. Pad 1 continues an extended reduction in distillate stocks fed by just-in-time inventories and the lack of imports from Europe. We'll talk a little more about that. So, uh, looking closer at New England, and this is just next slide, please. Just looking at New England and Pad 1A, Stocks continue at a very low level. Note that these stocks do not include the stocks at the generators, but they're right around 4 million barrels, and that's not a lot of reserve in the event of a strong rise in heating oil demand. So those will need to be watched very closely. And as noted in the gas section, severe cold weather can stress the supply of diesel, both for generator replacement and increased home heating needs, or generator replenishment and increased home heating needs. And resupply itself can be constrained because of the severe weather, and a high dependence on marine deliveries and trucks to end users can easily be compromised with freezing conditions. So, the next slide, I think, shows perhaps why Europe may not come to the rescue. So, okay, you can advance. Okay, thank you. Distillate prices in Europe have been sustained well above the U.S. East Coast since the Ukraine invasion. Current price differentials will inhibit any supply coming from Europe, barring an extended period of U.S. severe cold weather. As I noted before, we're currently exporting distillate from the Gulf Coast to Europe, like 300 to 400,000 barrels per month. That pretty much started at the end of the previous winter, and most of the imports into Pad 1 now are coming from Canada, and that's largely Irving oil. So, right now, apparently the prices aren't that high in Europe that Irving is shipping to Europe. But if Europe has a cold spell, Irving is going to have every inclination to supply Europe instead of supplying New England. So that's one thing to worry about as well. Barring some again unusual circumstances, the East Coast is going to have to rely on Colonial Pipeline, Pad 1 refiners, and the continued Canadian imports from Irving and other Canadian refiners to maintain supply during severe weather. So basically, one historically good option to replenish New England supply may be off the table. And just a quick look at distillate prices. This chart has a lot on it, but I'm not going to talk about much. The distillate prices in the green are distillate spot prices, New York Harbor versus Brent crude. Distillate prices have been relatively stable, and they've been, about at the same level for some time now, for more than a year. I mean, the spike of 2022 is in there, but things have been stable, and the futures markets are showing that they don't show any big tendency of prices to change one way or the other. Of course, that can always change. I mean, crude prices are very favorable right now, and distillate prices are still providing refineries a good incentive to produce distillate. Those crack spreads are in the range of $25 a barrel to run a barrel of crude and make distillate. So that's pretty good. So hopefully the refineries will continue running and generating distillate into the market. But it's so we expect that supply to continue. Okay, just a couple quick slides on kerosene. Kerosene's a niche product. It's extremely important in New England and the upper Midwest to blend into ULSD to prevent gelling of diesel in the extreme cold, especially for trucks. And it's required for any application in trucks or even for use in home heating oil. And it has to be 15 parts per million sulfur, which, since all the ULSD is 15 parts per million, it doesn't sound like it's a challenge, but it is a challenge because the spec for jet fuel sulfur, which is kerosene, is 3,000 parts per million. So most refiners do not have facilities to treat jet fuel to get the kerosene sulfur level down to 15 ppm for ULSD. So it's not a product that's produced much. I think its yield nationwide is like 0.1% of the total refinery output. So that's a challenge. And as a result, the kerosene stocks and prices need to be very closely monitored along with the weather outlooks. And the data to do that monitoring, from EIA and in the market is not as good as you would like to have. So, okay, we can move to the last slide. And so, uh, in looking at this, the data here is lagged. The last data we have is from July 31st, and both ULSK and kerosene are aggregated. So in New England, I think most of it is ULSK, but I don't know for sure because that breakout isn't provided. Um, in July, at the end of July, kerosene stocks were double where they were in 2024, which is good, and they're well above where they were in 2022. Um, so, sorry. So you can see that the days of supply or the stock levels in 2022 were extremely low, and uh, the spikes that occurred at that point in time were upwards of 350 a gallon over heating oil. So we had kerosene prices that were somewhere around $8, $9 a gallon in New England, and no supply to be had. And that situation, you don't want to have happen again. It got bad again in 2023. And the only way really to monitor it is since the data is not readily available, is to keep watching this price. So if you see this price start to shoot up, it moves pretty fast. When the supply is not there, people will pretty much bid anything to get kerosene to keep their homes warm, to keep their trucks running, and so on. And that's something we like to watch for and advise our clients about. And so that sums up the outlook. I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is what I have been trying to say is that I agree with Sonny. The infrastructure that's there for fuel management and awareness and response is not bad, but it's in some cases a little blind, and in other cases not quick enough to respond to some of the things that could happen. So if there's going to be volatility on supply, I'm sorry, if there's going to be volatility on weather, it's going to be an especially important winter to keep an even closer eye on fuel stocks and where things are going. I appreciate your time and sorry for being a few minutes over, but go ahead, Ben.
Oh, you're just fine, Tom. And we had about 10 minutes in there for questions, so you're right on time and doing great, and not really a problem either. So appreciate the outlook and how comprehensive it was. I know this was more of a last minute assignment for y'all, and really appreciate y'all stepping up and helping out so that we could give this outlook. It's very important for us to understand it. So as you were doing it, what data trends really surprised you the most this year in all of that when you were preparing all this? What was kind of the most surprising in it?
Well, I mean, learning more about what's happening in the propane markets and where that's going. Uh, you know, the we tend to look more at gasoline, distillate, jet fuel for our work for DOE Caesar, and propane gets I feel bad for propane. They get looked at this time of year, and if everything looks good, that's great. But I guess what I'm seeing that's a different trend is that the upper Midwest, which is not in great shape on propane to begin with, and because they have pretty small terminals and the pipelines can get congested in the winter coming up from Conway, is that one of their key uh, uh, levers to pull, if you will, to get resupply may be more in jeopardy as the Canadian export facilities continue to suck product over to Asia.
Yeah, that's been a growing concern and for a couple of years for several of us that watch propane, and and one that I was glad to see you point out so distinctly as a concerning trend that continues. Along that lines, and this may be out of your ballywick, so bear with me. Matt Milford asked if you could address the propane industry regulatory rules change for the hours of service waiver request that the industry's wanted for the entire winter season. Do we know where that stands or anything about that?
I don't know where that stands, so
And that's fine. Okay. That's yeah. That's way that's our concern, and we'll follow up with an answer with that, Campbell, and figure out where exactly we are. Paul did chime in there that we haven't seen a decision yet, and we've seen some comments more extended period. So no worries about that one. Are there any other questions from folks out in cyberspace? Please put it in the Q&A box if you've got a question for Tom about any of the fuels outlook you get. So with that, what kind of is the key determinant for energy expenditures that you're seeing impacting people, you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to come down to whether we see a nice normal winter or whether it's going to be volatile, as Sonny appeared to indicate. If it's going to be volatile, you're going to have, price run-ups when supply becomes short, and the fact that inventories look pretty good, all things considered, right about now, doesn't help a lot when you can lose a lot of inventory in a short amount of time, and then the next thing you know is you can't replenish the supply as quickly, and people start bidding up to get barrels to keep their customers supplied or to keep their homes heated. So, uh, to me, that's the risk, and I'd be very surprised if there weren't a number of events that maybe aren't a Uri type of an event or a 2018 polar vortex, but still drive prices higher, and people should hopefully try to make sure they keep their stocks at home in good stead, and the same goes for the folks in the agriculture business that are looking to keep things warm over the winter, especially in the upper Midwest.
Good advice. We all should definitely heed. The other last one I have is because I know you've been looking at the winter fuel outlooks for several years from EIA, and in your opinion, how accurate has that been in forecasting in the past?
I really didn't have time to think.
I know that's probably could be the whole 2 hours, but
Well, yeah,
just
and then they're trying to do their job and forecast, and I don't envy them, because they're looking at forecasting. What are they forecasting? The weather, or are they forecasting the demand for each of the different winter fuels? Okay, and then it's challenging what they do. So I don't mean to. I mean, if they've been wrong sometimes, well, they've been wrong sometimes. But I think what you have to do if you're a supplier of fuels or if you're a consumer of fuels is you have to watch the market and you have to see what things are happening and then make your own decision on what you've got to do. Not easy, okay? But I mean, if not everybody can look at the spread between the New York Harbor ULSK and ULSD market, but states should have access to that kind of information so they can at least let people know, hey, it looks like ULSK is getting tight up in New England. So, and then of course you have the potential then that if you know too much about that, then you might cause panic. But so you can't win, But it's I think you know I don't I people have to if you're running a home or a business that requires heating fuels, you have to be even more vigilant than usual because there's going to be infrastructure issues that take place over time, and that's going to impact what you can what you can achieve. And I think it's the world's going through a transition right now, and And I think Sonny spoke about it as well as I could ever do. So,
I think that's putting it mildly in a good place to stop. That I appreciate you taking it. It is a very nuanced. I don't envy that job either, but I do appreciate your job of coming today and helping us understand the markets price wise and the supply side. Because a good example is we quietly encourage behind the scenes folks to fill up commercial businesses to fill up with propane in the summer if they can, because that
yeah.
kind of helps them do cheaper prices. And appreciate your time. That's all the questions we have now. And I'll start transitioning to our final speaker. Campbell, did you have something, or are you just coming on camera? I didn't know if you had something in between before I got to the next speaker.
Oh no, I'm just popping in so y'all don't feel too lonely.
Okay, well,
We've
thank
got
you.
we've got two more, Ben.
Yeah, we do. Sorry, I said next. Last speaker, I almost forgot about Austin. Next, we're going to hear from Bob Tallman. He's a senior engineer with NERC, who's going to talk to us about the grid and its winter reliability assessment. What he can, anyway.
Thank you, Ben. I'd like to thank everyone for having NERC here to give this preview of our winter reliability assessment. My name's Bob Tallman. I'm a senior engineer within the reliability assessment group. And if we move to the next slide, I can tell you a little bit about seasonal assessments. We're required by statute to produce the summer and winter reliability assessments as the certified electric reliability organization. And we also do a long-term reliability assessment, which comes out every year. That's a 10-year look ahead. And these seasonal and special reliability assessments help us in our role as the Electric Reliability Organization, or ERO, to deliver on our vision for highly reliable, secure bulk power system. Our assessments are widely read by industry, policymaker, regulators, and government leaders, many of whom we have here on the call. We go to the next slide. We did have a change. If you were recall our slides from last year, we had 20 assessment areas, and out west they broke 4 assessment areas into several more to add to the granularity and just grouping together some of the areas into a more cohesive regions. And you can see that WEC Basin and WEC Rocky Mountain, they were all part of WEC Northwest last year. So we have some more areas, which it makes it a challenge to do year-over-year comparisons, but we will have that in this year's WRA based on some work by WEC to go over last year's number and kind of aggregate them into the new areas. So we have data collected from planners in these 24 assessment areas. And when we have the data, and we're in the process of doing this now, NERC, our regional partners in the ERO and area subject matters across North America, look at this data and we assess reliability concerns. And in our assessments, we rank each area if it's facing for the upcoming season a normal, elevated, or high risk of energy shortages for the upcoming season. Move on to the next slide, please. So we are, again, right in the midst of developing the 25-26 winter reliability assessment. This effort began back in July. We began collecting data and risk inputs. And we look at that, and the capacity and energy risk assessment is based on scenario analysis of both the average, the 50-50 expected peak demand, which 50% of the time the demand's below, 50% of the time the demand would be above, as well as extreme condition, which is typically a 90-10, where 90% of the time the demand is below that and 10% it's above. We do an evaluation of all risk periods, not solely the peak demand hour. Many areas that they coincide with one another, but others there's a different risk hour that we look at. We have as areas of additional focus for this year's winter assessment fuel supply concerns, and I appreciate the presentation Tom just had. I think that was very in-depth look at fuel supply. And then we have increases in electricity demand. I think that's a big highlight in this winter's assessment, as well as in the summer assessments and the long-term reliability assessment that will be published, I think in January. We're scheduled for that. The winter reliability assessment will be finalized and published just about a month from now, in mid-November. Go on to the next slide, please. So this slide, and this is all very preliminary data. We're still processing it and still getting updates, but we're pretty well along in the process right now. And here we're looking at areas that were identified as elevated risks last year and that have seen a decline in their reserve margin. So those are the ones that are highlighted on here. You see some declines, NASEO, Saskatchewan, slightly declining in New York, PJM, Cirque East, and which is the Carolinas area, and ERCOT, which is Texas. Next slide. Again, Tom went over this in greater detail. I think the coal stockpiles he may not have mentioned. This is the graph of stockpiles at coal-fired power plants through July of this year. And you can see a slight downward trend. Some of that is attributable to retired plants. So this number is just the aggregate of coal stockpiles at coal-fired power plants across, well, in this case, it's the United States. This is coming from the Energy Information Administration. And I included below a look at the forecasted retirements of power plants for the year 25 through next summer, 26. And you can see a couple of coal plants, large coal plants are included on that. Tom went over the other slide that's, or the other picture that's on the right of this, which is from EIA's Winter Fuels Outlook. Gas storage inventories are, as Tom went over, pretty much near or slightly above the last 5-year average. Next slide, please. So in our seasonal assessments, we generally provide a waterfall chart that shows the anticipated resources for the season, which is the dark blue bar on the far left. And we decrement with typical maintenance outages and typical forced outages. We then also look at if there are extreme low generation scenarios, for example, hydro, a heavily hydro dependent area, if they're experiencing a drought. And we also look at extreme forced outages of thermal units, and we'll add that in. We add back in operational mitigations that are available within the assessment area. And we compare that to the 50-50 net internal demand, which is the solid orange bar. And then we overlay that, the extreme winter peak demand, plus the area's expected operating reserve requirement. And we kind of see where we are if with typical maintenance outages and forced outages, and the area is below that dashed black line, we will, that is one reason to assign an elevated risk to that area. There are other probability analysis related to energy that could also show conditions that would require us to assess that area as elevated, or if it's bad enough, it's high risk. Next slide, please. So this is a preliminary view of the 25-26 winter we're going to call it potential risk areas. We're seeing elevated, the orange is elevated risk. There are no high risk areas as yet identified. We see some elevated risk in the Pacific Northwest and what we call the wet basin area. Texas, the Cirque East, which again is Carolinas, PJM, And then in New England, due to the pipeline and energy infrastructure constraints, and in the Canadian Maritimes. And we're going to continue to review the probabilistic assessments and risk scenarios, and we'll publish the final risk assessments and determination in mid-November. Next slide, please. So I want to recap last year's winter recommendations that came out of our report last year, stating regulators, policymakers support environmental transportation waivers when requested to manage potential emergencies. A lot of this often happens. As Tom was talking about New England and the dual fuel units, some areas have quite a bit of fuel, dual fuel units, and when they burn oil, oftentimes they'll have to seek a environmental transportation waiver. For grid owners and operators, cold weather preparation, the operators should review the seasonal operating plans, communication protocols, particularly with the gas industry, and lessons learned from previous winter storms like Uri, Elliott, and some of the more recent storms in last winter, which FERC usually has a technical conference or open meeting where they'll discuss that and how the industry operated through those periods. Generator readiness, generator owners should complete winter readiness preparations, deploy weatherization packages in advance of winter storms, and frequently check mitigations leading up to winter events and during the course of these cold weather events. Fuel balancing authority should implement generator fuel surveys to monitor the adequacy of fuel supplies, and load forecasting balancing authority should anticipate load forecast uncertainty and be prepared to manage potential reserve deficiencies. Next slide. That brings us to the end, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have and who might have.
All right, thank you, Bob. Just a reminder to please put your questions in the Q&A if you've got any. But before we get to that, you touched on it just a little bit. What progress has been made in implementing those recommendations from last winter's NERC assessments?
Well, I think you know, we've had a lot of recommendations that have come out of Winter Storm Uri and Elliott, and working our way through those. We have had one cold weather standards being approved last year that went into effect, and I think when FERC and NERC, well, we presented a review of last January's cold weather events, and it was generally much improved. Obviously, those storms in January were not of a duration like Elliott or Uri, but I think there was some, you know, encouraging operational improvements that we saw during those events. A little concerned, as I think you were when Sonny brought up the 2020 similarities to the upcoming winter. That was a very challenging year, and I think since then there were a lot of lessons learned, a lot of work being done to incorporate those into the planning and operations.
I can attest from the field that last winter was definitely not as impactful. We did have some constraints in the valley, as we call it for TVA, but definitely have seen a lot of progress since 2020 and those winters. The other one I wanted to ask was related to the increase in TOTC orders that we're seeing, and how do you think is that affecting coal stockpiles at all, and cause an increase in demand from those?
Could you ask the question again? What the orders?
Yeah, sure. So the TOTC orders that are extending the life of that DoD is issuing, and extending the life of some coal plants that were scheduled to shut down.
Yeah, again, you know, there have been some retirements, and some of those plants have stayed online. And when we look at the coal stockpiles, though they've been declining, they kind of look in line with the amount of coal-fired megawatts that still remain on the system.
All right. Any other questions from the crowd? I'm not seeing any at the moment. You covered it all. That's why. But I will say, if you haven't gone back and read the reports on Winter Storm Uri and Elliott, those are excellent documents, really break down the events and good digestible information. I learned a whole lot from both of them and appreciate the hard work that went into those, because y'all really got down granular with several things that have been good recommendations. And I do have one. Okay. Somebody said, Hadley did. Okay. How can emergency management prepare for or mitigate for energy shortfalls? Are there certain questions that we should be asking our energy providers?
Yeah, I'll go back to the recommendations related to the state regulators and policymakers on being attentive to the request for waivers during these events, whether they be environmental or transportation waivers, to enable the power plants to keep running, if they have to switch fuels, or whatever the case may be.
Thank you very much. And with that, I don't see any other questions at the moment, so we will let you go. And I really appreciate you taking the time to give us that detail, and we're looking forward to the final assessment being released.
Good. Thank you very much for having me here today.
All right. Thank you, Bob. And now we'll switch over to our final speaker, Austin Wicker from the National Propane Gas Association. Make sure that, yeah, there we go. I see you, Austin. Your slides are coming up. He's a senior manager of state government affairs with NPGA. So just to keep propane fresh in everybody's mind, if you know the answer, I'll go ahead and tee up and be thinking that federal motor carriers question, be thinking about that one, because I'll bring it back up at the end. But with that, I'll turn it over to you, and we've got about 20 minutes.
All right, thank you, Ben, and thank you, of course, to NASEO for having me back to present this year. I certainly appreciate it. I assume everyone can hear me okay. I am operating out of a hotel room currently off of hotel Wi-Fi, so if there are any issues or if anybody has any trouble hearing me, please drop that in the chat and I'll have that remedied. So with that being said, we will go ahead and dive right in. Next slide, please. Great. Thank you. So as we prepare for this winter, it's certainly important to understand the bigger reliability picture when talking about delivered fuels and winter preparedness posture. So in July of this year, the Department of Energy issued a report warning that our electric grid is approaching a tipping point, really, if you will. Accelerated retirements of reliable dispatchable energy combined with skyrocketing demand from electrification and, of course, data centers, the new hot topic, are creating serious risk of capacity shortfalls. So in that context, propane is uniquely positioned to help fill that gap because it's stored on site, deployable anywhere, and reliable even during extreme weather. Propane can provide critical backup power even when the grid is strained. So propane stands not only as a necessary energy source for those, of course, relying on residential, commercial, and industrial heating, but also for state energy planners and offices as they prepare for the winter season in the coming months. Additionally, the propane industry provides critical services to disaster recovery entities, which state energy offices rely upon during winter storm outages, such as the American Red Cross, pop-up hospitals, disaster shelters, and meal delivery and preparation services. So therefore, it is absolutely critical that state agencies work with the propane industry and that our industry works in tandem with state agencies at the national and state levels to ensure adequate supply and consumer education ahead of and during the winter season. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll go ahead and touch on some supply and pricing here quickly. So according to EIA's most recent report, as of October 16th, U.S. propane inventories nationwide were 102.37 million barrels or 120.5 days of supply. Nationally, propane inventories are at 760,000 barrels lower than they were at this time last year. Stocks in pads 1 and 3 are higher last week, really it's 2 weeks ago rather, than the same time last year. Stocks in pads 2 and 4 through 5 are currently below 2024 inventories. I will note that U.S. propane supply is on the high end of the 5-year average range, and there is certainly enough propane to satisfy domestic customers. But of course, it goes without saying that it is critical that propane suppliers and consumers communicate regarding needs and adjust their supply plans accordingly, especially leading into winter. And I will talk more on that later. And notably, as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen here, EIA forecasts that homes heating with propane will actually spend 9% less on heating costs this winter compared to last year. Is certainly an interesting forecast, especially compared to what they have forecasted with electricity at plus 4%. All right, you can go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So residential propane prices have remained steady at around $2.40 a gallon, which is consistent with this time last year. Of course, these prices are subject to demand from winter weather events and strain on propane transportation infrastructure. Next slide, please. So as you all know, a critical component of understanding and developing a preparedness posture for winter in regard to delivered fuel supply is to understand the propane industry's relationship to the agricultural industry. So we at NPGA regularly examine the USDA's crop report to gauge the need for gallons going to agricultural operations during the harvest season. So if there's a situation of a late wet harvest, it could cause a late rush for agricultural gallons, depleting marketers of storage ahead of the residential heating season. So I will briefly walk through the most recent crop report, which is from September 29th, of course, due to the government shutdown. So that's the most recent data that I have to navigate. So USDA's crop report as of September 29th of this year shows that corn planting is complete and that corn dented is at 95%. This year's corn crop is 71% mature, and 18% has been harvested across the 18 states that account for 92% of the corn acreage, which is slightly behind the 5-year average. Soybean planting is complete in the 18 states that represent 96% of the soybean acreage, 79% dropping leaves, and 19% harvested, in line with the 5-year average. So as I said, tracking crop progress is critical for our industry, and of course I would recommend for state energy offices as well, as crop drying facilities rely heavily on propane during the harvest season, and understanding these trends is absolutely necessary for industry stakeholders in preparation for the winter months. Next slide, please. So now I'll take a moment and briefly walk through what the industry does, generally speaking, internally to prepare for the heating season. So generally speaking, marketers hone in on 5 core elements to ensure adequate supply and movement of fuel to customers in a timely manner. So the first is demand. Know your gallon sales and customer type, know short and long-term weather forecasts, and know crop and harvest conditions and livestock needs. The next is supply. So know where your supplier sources your propane, be it from pipeline, rail, terminal, storage cavern, etc. What are your options if local production decreases, and what alternatives or backup does your supplier offer? The next is logistics. If you need extra propane, where can you get it from? What additional transportation do you have access to? And what is your logistical flexibility 30 days out? Next is storage. Can you lease or sublease primary storage? How much planned storage do you have, and how frequently do you turn over storage? And lastly is customers. How many customers are contracted versus you expect will cold call? What is the average tank size of your customers? And how do I schedule delivery routes during winter? So these are the general 5 principles by which most propane marketers will navigate their preparation as they head up into the winter heating season. Next slide, please. So in regard to consumers and residents, NPGA generally recommends that consumers communicate with their propane supplier and make a delivery plan for the heating season. I don't need to educate this group, but as you all know well, propane is not regulated by public utility commissions, so therefore the relationship is very much interpersonal. It is between the propane supplier, the propane marketer, and the customer. So it is critical that propane marketers, propane suppliers discuss with their customers, they educate their customers on the necessity to plan out their gallon amount, Now with new technology, there are tank monitors, so propane suppliers and providers are able to keep a closer tab on the status of their customers' tanks, but still communication is absolutely key. We also do always recommend, and I say that we give these recommendations to the industry then communicates this to their respective customers, but we always recommend, particularly ahead of the winter months, that customers ensure that their tank is readily accessible before refill. So, for example, clearing a path of snow so that the marketer member can get to the tank and refill it, ensuring that there are no large hanging icicles above the tank. You may laugh, but that's been an issue in the past. If that gets knocked loose, it can be dangerous. So we always do, of course, we always recommend that that customers keep a path clear to their tank, but especially during the winter months when we face snowfall and especially large levels of snowfall in particular areas of the country. So following the recommendations of their propane supplier is absolutely essential for keeping their heating system operational and their family warm during winter. All right, next slide, please. So as far as our interaction with state energy offices, what I will say is that while NPGA is always at NASEO's disposal, we are always at the disposal of state energy offices. I highly recommend that you all please take my name down, take my information. I'm always happy to provide that. We are always happy to help. But really, your first stop, your best bet for an immediate issue is your state or regional association. If you do not know who that is, you can go to npga.org. And you can go to My State, and we have an interactive map where you can go. Most states are individual state associations, although we do have some areas that have been compiled into a regional association. The name of the state executive is there. Those tend to be the people that are on the front lines. They know what's going on in your area and is your best bet. But again, NPGA is always a resource to state energy offices. I do have a note to coordinate with the State Energy Assistance Program. Of course, that is LIHEAP is a little bit up in the air right now. It's a sensitive topic, but of course, that is something that the propane industry has very carefully been following and is very, very much invested in. And so that's a story that everyone is very familiar with. We do during the winter months, particularly, we regularly track hours of service waivers. So if there is a large winter storm or anything that necessitates an hours of service waivers declaration, we are tracking that and we post that actively. We actively update it on our website. So we hope that that can be a resource to state energy offices that are curious, be it in their own state, although you all are usually very familiar with what's going on in your own state, other states around you, or would just like to know what is going on. NPGA regularly updates that on our website. So again, state associations are on our website. I believe I briefly saw Ben drop that in the chat, so please feel free to check that out. And again, I will just end it by saying thank you to NASEO. You all are indispensable to our industry. You all have been a fantastic partner. It's been a pleasure working with you all, and we look forward to it, especially as we head into these winter months. So thank you all very much.
All right. Thank you, Austin. Great remarks as usual, and appreciate you coming back this year for another round of it. And hopefully we'll get through another winter together. We always do. But that the hours of service waiver site I put in there, that is a wonderful website to track those in winter. I've even pointed federal motor carriers and said, hey, let's keep up with what NPGA is putting on their website, please, because sometimes y'all are more current. So that's also good because it helps us fact check things like that. Sometimes you wonder, is there really another one out there, or have you heard? And sometimes it's misinformation that we're trying to track down and hear that, well, this state has one issued, and if I don't see it there or I haven't heard from my counterpart, then I tend to not think that it's been issued yet. So that's always great resources for us. So one of the first questions, I'm just going to go straight to it, is that federal motor carriers request that NPGA made for the blanket hours of service waiver for winter. What's the status of that? Can you update us on that?
Sure. The latest update that I have is not super exciting. It's basically that we haven't heard anything back yet. So and just for context, because I know Campbell and I we had a meeting with a few state offices that were interested, and Benjamin Nussdorf is our general counsel, and he handles all the regulatory affairs. He wrote the request, and he's been handling all of that with FMCSA. From the last update that I have received, because I'm really the middleman in regard to that, is that we are just effectively waiting to hear back from FMCSA. So I unfortunately don't have an active update. What I will say, just to let the group know, again, for context, Campbell and I had Benjamin Nussdorf on. We had a handful of state energy offices that just wanted to learn more about our request, why we requested it, and he really took a deep dive into that. That offer still stands. If any state office wants to know more about it, would like to hear our side of the story, an explanation, would like to just pick Ben's brain, we are more than happy to do that. So please reach out to Campbell, and we are at your all's disposal and happy to facilitate that conversation.
Thank you very much for that offer. It really was that was a very helpful call, and it helped clarify things. And Ben did a great job explaining it. But that just comes with the name, right? The other question, Matt Milford asked, and he would like to, and this I'll kind of put out to anybody, because he asked if anybody knows more about the status of LIHEAP and what's going on with that at the moment. It sounds like you don't. So if I don't know if any of our others would with that, Campbell, that may be something for us to comment on after. So the other one is with looking at the stock and the inventory and all that you covered with that. What do you think is going to be the what do you see as kind of our pinch point going into winter that you're concerned about?
Well, I'll give a more of a 30,000 foot view. I think there's and I say 30,000 foot view because I'll take it at actually more of less of like a logistical angle, but more of a broad issue angle that we're facing. We, like every other industry, are facing workforce challenges, and I think every single winter it's just going to become an increasingly difficult issue, or increasingly greater concern, right? So MPGA, we have 2,300 member companies, give or take, most of whom, I would say 95% of whom, are small family-owned businesses, right? So they're running 5 employees, 10 employees, something to that effect. Quick little fact is that the average age of a propane bobtail driver is 55 years old. So they're getting right up on that cusp of that retirement age. So when we're looking towards winter, if we're thinking 5 years from now, 10 years from now, that's going to be a real issue. If we cannot start attracting and retaining workforce for the critical components of delivery, then a question, excuse me, a question of if we have enough inventory coming in, if we have enough stocks, is really not the question, right? It's really going to become a transportation logistical issue, a workforce issue. So I think that's something, I know for a fact that's something that's on the mind of a lot of our members, especially our small to medium-sized members. It's difficult to attract and retain people. My ongoing joke is everybody out of high school wants to be a YouTuber now. So what are you going to do? Yeah. They don't really want to drive a propane bobtail, even though there's fantastic benefits and it's a fantastic career. And just in that same vein, again, I know I'm tying this to sort of a broader concept to your question. The enhanced enforcement of English language proficiency rules is something we've been following carefully. We do not see this as beneficial to aiding in workforce development issues. So this is another thing that we are closely monitoring. So there's a broad set of things that contribute to supply and logistical questions leading up to winter. This is one of them that I know has really been on. I'm at a board meeting for internally right now, and this is yet another thing that has been brought up is workforce challenges, and I do think it's going to be a reckoning, not just for our industry but for other industries in the next few years.
No, I think that's a really good insight. I know that that's been an issue even with some specific suppliers that we have in Tennessee, and that's been some issues. And I think Personally, I think that's a good opportunity for veterans to plug in that have been driving things in war zones, so they could probably drive a propane truck with a little help in licensing. Another one there is, could you discuss, sort of shed some light on us why the U.S. exports, I'm going back to what Bob said earlier and about the U.S. exporting such large quantities of propane. Um, I understand that the demands there in Asia year round, but winters when we need the domestic supply so much so. Could you help shed some light on why we export so much that direction, even in winter?
Yeah, I don't have a tremendous amount of insight as to, and geopolitically why. I mean, it's not a fantastic answer, I understand, but genuinely, I'm just somewhat ignorant on it. What I will say is that we do have a really established market in Asia, Asia and other markets, of course. Asia is sort of the standard example, and there's just demand year round. So if there's demand, then there's going to be propane suppliers that will be shipping it. Something that is interesting is actually the Chinese plastics industry is actually heavily dependent indirectly on the propane industry because of propylene, which is a byproduct. And they utilize propylene in plastics production. So there's sort of a consistent high demand. Again, that's not exactly a hard and fast answer. I understand. I don't really have a hard and fast answer to give you, so I don't want to do that. But there is consistent demand. As long as there's consistent demand, there will be suppliers who will be shipping it out.
All right, thank you. Fair enough. Also, so is there Matt added the comment that the increase in propane production in the Northeast Marcellus is exceeding Northeast demand, even in winter, which is leading to exports in the Northeast of propane because of worldwide demand. So that's a good comment, Matt.
Yeah,
Appreciate that. Any other questions for Austin before we start opening it up to the whole panel? And I know that you have to get back to your board meeting, and I really appreciate you taking out the time. And please thank your board for letting us borrow you for a little while so that you could give us this update, and we'll let you go back to it.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure. And again, the offer stands for any offices that would like to know more about our FMCSA request. And you can find my information on NPGA's website. You can go to npga.org, go to staff. My information is there. Always reach out to me with any questions that you all have. Happy to help.
Thanks so much, Austin. We appreciate your time. And now we'll bring back the rest of the panel for the open Q&A. This is when, if you had burning questions that were you didn't ask during the first round, this is the time to ask some and bring back the whole panel so that we can get some good discussion going before we close out here in about 13 minutes. So with that, let's bring back Sonny and the Bobs. Sounds like a band name, doesn't it? And Tom. If not, I'm going to kick it off with what specific weather patterns do you think might anticipate and threaten fuel delivery and grid reliability this season, and sort of what should be on the state's radar? I feel like we've touched on it, but let's pound it one more time. What do y'all see as the biggest weather pattern threats for that?
I personally would say that I think we often underestimate ice in the forecast. And I think this year is going to show us why that's often a fallacy in forecasting, is that we say it's difficult to annotate ahead of time how much ice, but it is important this year, specifically with the fluctuations in temperatures. You're more likely to see icing because of the abnormal warming ahead of time. It's going to create a larger warming zone in which freezing rain will likely come down in greater quantities.
Well, that's very helpful. Others? Bob or Tom? Want to touch that one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would just say that if that's the case and ice is going to be the bigger problem, then you could be looking at some substantial power supply problems, obviously, if that's going to cause upsets to the grid. So and that's not an easy one to fix. It takes time, and transmission lines are down, and local distribution of electricity is heavily impacted. It's going to take some time to restore power. So that and you just, I mean, utilities handle this. They know how to do that. They get crews ready and prepare for it, but it's going to take some response time, and hopefully the ice issues are relatively limited, and we don't have like an issue all up and down Appalachia with ice, for example.
Mhm.
So that's my thought. I don't disagree with that.
No, I think that's a good assessment. Bob, anything else to add?
I think I haven't been in the utility industry for many decades. Ice is kind of the greatest nightmare, right? It impacts everything, generation, transmission lines, and NERC is and oversees the planning operations of the bulk power system, but even on the distribution line, that's a really bad scenario with distribution lines on the ground because of heavy ice loading. That takes a long time to recover. Uh, so yeah, I hope Sonny's wrong about that, but
I hope so as well. No one likes to see ice, basically. I think we can all agree on that one. So during along that with some of the let me try this again. What leading indicators like terminal inventories, availability, should states monitor that would help us justify time limited waivers like hour service, weight limits, and other stuff, and that are good things for us to be asking industry for, and how early possibly should we be asking folks for that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Ben. I mean, uh, I it's there's almost no advantage to not asking early. Okay, in other words, if you start seeing a cold wave in New England that's causing the distillate market to jump up, and it's causing the kerosene market to jump up, uh, things need to get rolling to be able to keep supply going into people, and it could also impact the deliveries to power generators as well. So when you start seeing those are the indicators I would be looking for. What's happening to the distillate market, what's happening to the kerosene spread versus distillate, and if those things are starting to inch up, they don't usually inch up, they usually just rocket up. So when those things happen, it's telling you you've got a problem and you need to get some quick attention to, more hours for people to move trucks because it's going to be slower moving in that situation as well.
Very true. Sonny or Bob?
I don't know that I've got a whole lot on the energy side. That's I don't like stepping on toes, but the transportation side's definitely on my end because I hear from the truckers all the time. When a road closes down, we don't have that mapping system on the geospatial side to say this road's closed, go here instead. In a lot of these community areas, so you're going to find that some of the areas that are going to need the supplies during something like ice or a heavy snow buildup where they don't own the plows, they're not going to be able to move as fast because of the hindrance, not only in compacts, everyone's going to need resources in that region. So even the compacts are going to be strained on who's able to give what. But the transportation side, the roadways having taken damage recently with subsidence and flooding erosion and the generalities of the wear and tear of EVs, which weigh twice as much as a standard car does on the impacts to just road material, we're anticipating more potholes, more sinkholes on top of that. So just the delays across the transportation side is going to go up too.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment and very true. All right, Matt asked, and I'm going to pull Matt's question from the chat. He said, do you believe there is sufficient biodiesel and renewable diesel domestic production to satisfy winter demand for biodiesel and renewable diesel, given the changes in tax credits and severely curtailed imports with recent economic and regulatory changes? So he's honing in on biodiesel and renewable diesel production.
Well, my comment is that's a worthy concern because I think some of the biodiesel producers and even the renewable diesel producers that are backed by major oil companies are struggling. with the market, transitioning like it has in the last, well, with the new administration and with the changing incentives. So, so I think, I don't know how much, I mean, New York has some biodiesel mandates. I don't know how the supply is there on biodiesel, but biodiesel producers aren't doing well, nor are renewable diesel producers.
Fair enough. Thanks for the comment. And Sunny added a great comment in the chat about a few other weather network trusted by rural communities are anticipating ice storms to be headlining. So be sure and check that out as well. The last question, this may be a little more for Bob, and that is, of course, as we get talking about it, we touched on it a little bit with, do we see any other um, states, do we see with the advent of all these data centers and the shifts in demand going into winter, that of course is the question that I'm getting asked a lot, is all these data centers going to keep the lights on in the winter? And that's a really broad one, but I think um, what are your thoughts on what impacts new data center loads and backup generation could affect fuel constraints or other demand spikes?
I think demand growth in general is a focus of the seasonal assessment this year. It is notable. Data centers are usually around the clock loads, so they impact demand across all hours, all seasons. And it has been very noticeable in some assessment areas. I think it accounts for, I showed you the slide where the reserve margin had declined in some areas. Of the load growth is a significant portion of the reason for that. And it is a challenge. There is after a long period of slow or little or no growth in some areas, we've seen over the last few years significant load growth, and data centers are a big contributor to that.
And right, and how those data centers have backup power is a big question.
Yes.
So they can develop their own backup power systems using diesel, propane, or natural gas. And the more they do that, that will help the grid, but it's not going to be cheap. And anyhow, I also did want to mention real quickly too that you mentioned rural issues, and I think it's worth noting that what's been happening up in Alaska with the storms up there is awful, and I'm not sure what could be done to mitigate those type of issues in the future, but it's difficult to get resilience in an area like that, and I'm just hoping those folks are okay, and I think it's probably worse than those of us down here in the U.S. really can appreciate, given the level of destruction from what we've seen. So just I'm not sure how that problem gets solved very quickly, but there needs to be a more reliable, and maybe not just in Alaska, but in other areas that have pretty significant rural concept, like remote areas in Maine and so on, or have similar disconnection from the power grid and fuel supply at different times, and that's a difficult area to address. But I think it's going to have to get more attention.
A really good point with the North Shore of Alaska. Right now, there are 5 villages up there, if you're not aware, that suffered Category 4 typhoon hitting up there, and it's caused severe flooding. I happen to know their emergency manager. She was in it. We took a class together for a year, and she came down to Tennessee for, and she's struggling. She's still hanging in there, and they're still trying to get resources up there. But most of that area is dependent on single diesel generators for
Yeah.
power up there. And so that's really what they're dependent on. So it's mainly keeping the diesel flowing to them right now, and trying to just get resources up there. And the resource constraints of just the logistics of getting flying stuff up there, and the roads are really challenging for them. So it's fortunately, I will say that the professor for that class is also in Alaska, and he's gone up there to directly help her with the response. One of the most interesting things from being up there was they have a hard time selling emergency management as a concept in Alaska in general, because one of the elders in the village, she was one of the villages, flat out said, well, it's only an emergency because you weren't prepared. And that just always stuck with me, because that was that's really more the attitude up there. And a lot of us would do much better if we went into things saying, oh, well, yeah, it is an emergency, but we could have been better prepared. And I think it's really good on how they have the individual onus of being prepared, period, is something we could all emulate. And I think on that note, Campbell, we're right at time. Look at that. So I will thank all our panelists for participating today and your wonderful remarks and taking the time out. I know we all have busy days and schedules, but this is always very helpful for the state energy offices, and we appreciate the good work that you do in helping us stay prepared to serve our constituents and our people. With that, Campbell, I'll close it up. Anything else?
Nope, just a big thank you to you as well, Ben. Sonny, Bob, Tom, really appreciate the time today and the prep time as well. And we'll see you all next year, if not for our summer energy outlook.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Campbell. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.